because they were very impressed with the clips that we're going to now show, which is Neil Oliver from GB News talking about banks. Now, this raises many, many points and questions, which UK Column is going to do our very best to get stuck into in future news editions. But let's have a little listen to what Neil had to say, and we'll have some interaction and comment on each one as they come up. This is the first of three.
I want to tell you a story about money. To be more specific, I want to tell you where money comes from. The truth of which most people are unaware is that money is created out of thin air. Furthermore, every single pound, dollar, euro, yen, and all the rest is created out of thin air by unelected, unaccountable bankers who meet in total secrecy and profit always from their actions. Let's imagine you want to borrow £200,000 to buy a house. When you go to the bank and ask for that money, the banker doesn't give you existing funds, cash from a drawer, for instance. Instead, he creates that £200,000 out of nowhere, money that previously didn't exist. That money is not backed by anything real, no gold or anything else. It's conjured out of nowhere and exists now only because the banker says it does. He then says you have to pay him back the £200,000 plus, let's say for the sake of argument, another £200,000 in interest. He's allowed to credit your account with money that did not exist until you asked for it, and he pressed digits on a keyboard, and then he charges interest on that previously non-existent sum. Talk about a foolproof way to make money. This is how all money is created in our world, and this is why so many people are made to live crippled by debt. Every year, the British people pay tens of billions of pounds to private bankers as interest on something that did not exist in the first place. How could I be sure? But I suspect that if you or I were to attempt something similar, we'd be thrown in jail before our feet touched the ground. William Patterson, co-founder of the Bank of England in 1694, noted that, quote, "The bank hath benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing." 1694, that's at least as long as this has been going on. How long we've been submitting to debt created by a handful of rich people to keep everyone else under their control. The Bank of England is technically owned by the British government and so notionally by the British people. The fact of the matter, however, is that the government does not tell the bank what to do. Like all central banks, the Bank of England is seemingly answerable to an entity called the Bank for International Settlements. The BIS is run by more unelected, unaccountable, secretive people over which we, the British, like all people in the world, have no say and no control.
Well, I want to say first of all that I think he had tremendous courage in actually putting that piece out, because he's getting into some areas which clearly mainstream media, as it's still called in some places, is really prevented from delving into the banks and how they work. The clip has also prompted a lot of discussion inside UK Column, and we're going to do more, as I say, in coming editions to talk about this. But just first of all, David, what's your reaction on the fact that we're talking about money created out of nothing?
Well, this is a vital point that people have to understand. And to illustrate why that's right, when you go to a bank and you get a loan, you get a bit of paperwork and it says about your loan or words to that effect. It doesn't say our loan, it says your loan. And banks don't make mistakes like that. They mean it. It is your loan. You're borrowing from yourself. That's why there's only one signature. When you sign the contract, if you sign a contract with another party and they're giving you valuable consideration and you're agreeing to pay for it, both parties sign the contract. When you sign for the bank loan, you sign. No one else signs, you sign. Because essentially you're borrowing it from yourself. And it's the security that you offer that creates the money. So thin air is how I would typically characterize it as well. It's not exactly that. It's not exactly thin air. It's the security that you create that actually creates the money. But it's the banking system that does it. Neil Oliver's quite right that if you and I did that, that would be called fraud, counterfeiting, and we'd be arrested. But the banks have a special privilege granted by the state to do just this. And of course, it's in the interest of the state because the state is the biggest borrower. I wouldn't quite agree with the relationship between the banks and the central bank and the Bank of International Settlements. And I think the role of the government is far bigger than Neil was suggesting there. But very interesting points. And the core idea here, which is that when you go and make a loan from the bank, they're not giving you something they already have. They're giving you something that you create with your own signature on the paperwork that didn't exist before and was created out of nothing. This is part of the mystery of banking, and it's a weird and wild world indeed.
Indeed. Well, I know Mark is itching to come in on this, but I'm just going to play clip 2, and Mark will then bring you on for some comment. Let's have a look at the second part of the clip.
Most people have never even heard of the Bank for International Settlements, but it's housed in a great glass tower in Basel in Switzerland. It is the BIS that oversees the making and flow of well over 95% of the world's money supply, via, to name but a few, the Bank of England, the US Federal Reserve, the People's Bank of China, the Central Bank of the Russian Federation, and the European Central Bank. It also influences a host of other smaller central banks, including in unstable and failed states like Afghanistan and Libya. We need an honest and open conversation about banks, all banks, and about another way of doing things, a way of potentially freeing the people of the world from the yoke of debt placed across their shoulders by secretive, unaccountable, profiteering private bankers. It may or may not offer the solution to our woes, but I believe it's time now to talk about it, and more importantly, to invite more people to understand what banks actually do and how they do it. If you don't trust me, how about Thomas Jefferson, founding father and third president of the United States, who said, "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow banks to control the issue of their currency, they will deprive people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs." The Federal Reserve in the US was created at Christmas time 1913, when most members were away for the holidays. By means of the Federal Reserve Act, all control over money creation was removed from Congress and given to the Federal Reserve Corporation, a private company controlled by bankers. All this despite Article 1 of the US Constitution, which declares, "Congress shall have the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof." Federal was added to the name to trick the people into thinking they, via Congress, were in control. Not anymore. Not since that Christmas of 1913.
So there we have it, a little bit more. David, what's your take on the second clip there?
Well, yeah, firstly, Bank of International Settlements, the book on this is called The Tower of Basel. It's very good. And it shows you how it kind of came out of the war reparations from Germany after the First World War. And then once that was kind of done, it didn't have a purpose, and it kind of created a bureaucratic organization, created a purpose for itself. Initially, it was very hard money and sound and sensible, and the banking policies it was actually introducing were really quite good, not at all what it is now. And it changed over the years and morphed into something else. And it had one or two scandals along the way, for example, endorsing the seizure of the Czechoslovakian gold by the Nazis, because once they invaded the country, then they became the country, so the gold was theirs. And the BIS said, "Yeah, that's fine by us, mate. No problem." So, yeah, an interesting organisation. The issue with the profit-seeking private bankers is, of course, not necessarily themselves, but the whole legal framework and backing up by the state. Because what happened when the profiteering private bankers in 2007 were bust, right? They should have all lost everything. Yes, private enterprise. Sorry, thanks for playing. You're no more. But that's not what happened. They were bailed out by the taxpayer. So it's this interaction, and of course, once that's done all restraint is really gone, because there's now an acceptance that whenever there's a problem, and we've seen it just in this last 2 weeks, whenever there's a problem, the central bank will come in, they'll create money, they'll buy government bonds, they'll inject money into the country, into the economy, they'll do quantitative easing, they'll create money, and the creation of money will fix things, and the central bank will look after you, and it'll all be backed by the state. This is the kind of strange inflationary world that we're in, and there is no accountability left for the banks because it's all underwritten by the taxpayer.
Okay, David, thank you. And Mark, what is your take on this?
The first thing I want to point out is it's great that this is being done by GBN because the media reform that we need is, in my mind, largely a prerequisite for the banking reform. We have to have a way to get these discussions out there to enough people at the same time to where we can have broad discussions in America, in Great Britain, and elsewhere, and it begins to expose the duplicity of the banksters. We can argue a little bit later about exactly how we'd reform things if we were to end the Fed, for example. So this really starts the process that needs to be happening. That being said, the Bank for International Settlements, which I covered a little bit in a recent article about the Jackson Hole annual meeting in Wyoming, and one of their bankers from the BIS, Augustine Carstens, was there calling for a new globalism. That bank is an enigma, if there ever was an enigma. We have to have a lot of demystifying as to what the BIS actually is. What does it do? And that's something that even some of the most learned monetary reformers I've talked to are not real knowledgeable about. So one thing that UK Column can do, among others, is look harder and deeper and longer at the Bank for International Settlements. I'd also add something too, what I've learned, and it kind of complements what David was saying about when a bank makes a loan. Not only are you the one creating the loan, and they don't use their depositors' money, nor do the banks use their assets to fulfill that loan, the loan is also an asset to the bank. It's entered as a demand deposit account, and it becomes an asset because you're paying interest on it, and you're collateralizing all your property, your land, your house, could be your automobile, depending on what the loan is for. Is it a mortgage? Is it an auto loan? Whatever. But you're pledging your assets against that loan. So the loan is an asset to the bank because it's an interest-bearing loan, and they're on the receiving end of those interest payments. But of course, it's a liability to everyone else. And this is admitted in books like Modern Money Mechanics that are published by the Federal Reserve. And some of the monetary reformers I've worked with over the years as a reporter have shown me the books from the Fed, and they very clearly spell out and admit what they do. And if anyone else did it, it would be considered a crime, basically, and you'd go to jail for a very long time. And so, and the money born out of thin air thing, what Jefferson said, I think, delineates that point the best. And this commentator talked about Jefferson. Jefferson talked about that money needs to be a public issue, and other people around his time talked about that. If it's created from thin air, that's not necessarily the problem. The problem is the interest-bearing nature of it, the debt-based part of it. And under the U.S. Constitution, anyway, under Article 1, as was alluded to, the Congress should, and I know that sounds counterintuitive now because Congress is a pretty sorry institution at this time, but the Congress, at least in principle, should be deciding the terms of money entering the economy, not the bankers, because the amount that the bankers put into the economy is based largely on their own calculations, their own needs. But ideally, or at least theoretically, the people's house, the Congress, is supposed to put the amount of money into the economy and the terms for doing so based on the people's needs, not some private consortium of bankers. So They would maybe line up the amount of money with productivity levels to make sure, kind of like a motor, right? You have to have the right amount of oil in the motor, not too much, not too little, so the motor runs properly. Or a hot air balloon. If it's too inflated, it floats too high. If it's deflated, it hits the ground. So you find the happy medium.
Mark, I'm just going to cut in slightly because we're watching the clock, and you've mentioned the Bank of International Settlements. We've anticipated your needs, so we've got a little bit to talk about them. But before we do, the third very short clip from Neil Oliver, where he was talking about the Bradbury. And I'm going to say I've got a soft spot for this particular subject because it was really the subject that started me on my journey to understanding at least something about the money supply system. And we know that a great many people from very early days in the UK column have done a huge amount of work on the banking system. And a lot of that has been predicated on having a look at what the Bradbury pound actually was. So let's have a look at this last little bit from Neil Oliver where he's talking about the Bradbury.
But by 1914, the Bank of England had already been involved in dodgy dealings, creating money out of nothing. And there were far more banknotes in circulation than there was gold in the vaults to honour them. If everyone tried to get their gold out at once, such a run on the bank would have been catastrophic. At a stroke, Britain would have lost its ability to pay for the upcoming war. The bankers ran for help to the government and to the Chancellor, David Lloyd George. The August bank holiday was extended by 3 days. An act was rushed through Parliament, and when the banks reopened, people were offered a new kind of treasury note, issued not by the bank, but by HM Treasury, in lieu of their gold. Since the first batches bore the signature of Sir John Bradbury, the then permanent secretary to the Treasury, the public nicknamed them Bradbury pounds. Because each was backed by the wealth of the nation, the familiar strapline about a promise to pay the bearer on demand was unnecessary and therefore absent entirely. The people accepted the Bradbury pounds, trusted them on sight as cash they could see and hold and spend as they liked with perfect confidence, and the banks were saved from certain collapse. It was sovereign money, underwritten by the wealth of the nation, and perhaps most valuable of all, by the creativity and potential of the people of that nation.
Well, there we are. Now, David, we are very short for time, and I do want to finish off with coverage on the Bank of International Settlements, because still many people have never heard of this very, very powerful bank. Neil Oliver went on to say some other things, and he was particularly keen to say that basically it was time that we started to investigate the banking system. There were a lot of questions to be asked if we were going to get to the bottom of how things worked. So I just want to stress that because he did go on to say some other things. The Bradbury pound, I've admitted, kick-started my own interest. You have some concerns over the exact phrasing that he's used in the piece to camera. Just very quickly, take us into a little bit of the Bradbury.
Yeah, so what the Bradbury was essentially quantitative easing, 1914 fashion. And it introduced extra money. Now, there was particular quirks about there because money at that point was gold, and gold sovereigns were circulating, and gold sovereign was a pound, not 380 as it costs now. And the smallest actual paper note was 5, which is equivalent to about 400 quid in normal money. So if there was a run on gold, there simply wouldn't be enough cash to pay wages and generally grease the wheels of the economy. So that was the worry. There was also huge pressures on all of the main banking institutions. So what the Bradbury was a form of quantitative easing. And it was introduced along with huge capital controls, closing down the stock market, massive bailouts. The government, the Treasury, took from the banks all of their non-performing debt because they had a lot of international debt from countries that were at war and couldn't repay. So all of these loans were now threatening the liquidity and survival of the British banks. So all of those loans were taken on by the government. People will start to recognise this. It sounds like 2007, 2008. So there's an awful lot to learn from the 1914 crisis. The idea that it was backed is one I would question, because it was there to basically allow the government to get the gold, and it was given as an equivalent to gold. Now, the people never got their gold back because after the war, we went back on the gold standard in 1925, but only in increments of 400-ounce bars. So if you were wealthy enough that you could buy a 400-ounce bar, which is what, £600,000 at today's money, then you could still go to the Bank of England and swap your money for gold. If you were an ordinary person, that right had gone, and it only, that little bit back in the gold standard only lasted to 1931, and then it was gone forever. And when the final link to gold went in 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, that's when we saw the pound run away. If you compare it to gold, it had gone from £4 odd an ounce to £16 an ounce in 1971. It's now nearly 100 times that. So the actual value of our currency has been eroded hugely. And it's this sort of inflationary nature that's a concern. But nonetheless, it's very interesting areas. We were talking about this last night. We're summarising that there's three ways of getting money into the economy. The banks can create it, the government create it, or we can create it, the market, the people, and that's usually a commodity-based money. That's where I think the solution lies. Other people may have a different view.
Okay, David, thank you very much for that. Well, in just a few minutes, let's give our audience a bit of a lightning tour of the Bank of International Settlements, maybe the biggest bank you've never heard of. So their annual report is a great place to start. And something people will notice when we look at the total comprehensive income there, up at 918.1 million. So there's definitely things coming in, but it's labelled as SDR, special drawing rights. Now, I haven't got time to go into that at the moment, but let's just have a quick look at the bank itself. Here's Augustine Carstens, who I think Mark Anderson mentioned a few moments ago, and you can read the foreword here yourself if you freeze this, where he's talking about how well they're doing and how well their interaction is going with the other central banks. Now, the BIS comprises memberships of some 63 other central banks, and we should run a little video here so that you can actually see who all those banks are. And what you quickly come to realize is that the BIS has got its tentacles in countries across the world. This is an immensely powerful organization, but as we will see it's very secretive. But there we are. There's the list of the banks taking part in the BIS system. And if we have a look at their board, the eagle-eyed people will spot straight away that we've got Andrew Bailey sitting on the board of the BIS. Now, he's the big man for the Bank of England, which says that it's open and transparent. But as we shall see with the Bank of International Settlements, it's anything but. How do you reconcile the two things? I'd suggest that you can't. So we shouldn't worry at one level, because the Bank of England is only about promoting the good of the people in the United Kingdom. So, David, I think you can relax, because we're in good hands with the Bank of England. We're here to care for you, really, is what they say. But if we delve into the BIS, the first thing to understand is that they're set up almost as a nation state within their home territory of Switzerland. And I've taken some excerpts of the documentation which show how powerful they are, because they list data showing that nobody else is going to come in and look at what they're doing. And some of this is really quite incredible, but read it, because basically not only can authorities not get into their premises, as we shall see here, they don't really want to pay taxes, and so the bank, its assets, income and other property shall be exempt from direct federal, cantonal and communal taxes. So this is the way you do it. Tax, that's just for the little people with the Bank of International Settlements. But if they have got their own state within a state in Switzerland, I was very interested to discover this on the Bank of England site, because if we look down at the bottom, we've got a little deal which was done. The Bank for International Settlements and the Bank of England launched Innovation Hub London Centre. And I didn't get a warm feeling about this. Here's the news release saying that it's the fourth new BIS Innovation Hub Centre in 2 years. We shouldn't worry, because they're focused on 6 areas, which is technical innovation, next generation financial market infrastructures, central digital bank currencies, open finance, cybersecurity, and green finance. And of course, you've stressed, Mike, on several occasions that the banks themselves are saying if businesses don't get the green side of life right, they're going to be put out of business. But if we look at a little bit more detail, this hub is one of a number of hubs that the BIS has operated, is now opening worldwide. And as we're going to see, each hub is a state within a state. But does the government know what's going on? Well, our old friend Richie Sunak had this to say at the time the hub was opened. The UK is known for pushing the boundaries of digital finance, so it's great to have the new innovation hub operating here. Its works will help central banks to support safe innovation and boost our efforts to capture the extraordinary potential of technology. So nothing to worry about. But here's the agreement, host country agreement between the Bank for International Settlements and the government of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It's the real deal document because you can see the signatures at the end of it. And why are we interested? Well, because basically they have ensured freedom of action, clear of anything the government might do. And the premises are their private premises. Nobody's going to come into it, whether administrative, judicial, military, police, they're not going to be entering. So this is a city within a city. And are they going to pay tax and excise duty? No, they're not. That's really not for us. And we're not talking Switzerland. We're now talking about BIS in UK. This is what Andrew Bailey had to say. As a central bank, we recognise the importance of innovation for the global financial system and look to support its safe deployment wherever possible. This requires collaboration between public authorities in all jurisdictions, and the BIS Innovation Hub is an important global initiative for achieving this. So Andrew Bailey claims with one hand that he's open and transparent, with the other hand, or the other part of his body, he's sitting on the BIS board, which is anything but transparent, and is also going to close its doors to authorities in UK. So if you want to know what they're really up to, this is something which Debbie Evans discovered. Here is the BIS Bulletin on Health and Privacy, Technology to Combat the Pandemic. And here is the editor of this particular bulletin series, a Korean gentleman. But what are they looking at? Well, they're starting to look in who is controlling data. And now we come down to the real question of what this hub is about, because they're sucking in private data, and that data is going into a system that the UK public has no right to see what is happening at any stage. So I'm going to end on this one, Mike, which you had up a couple of days ago, because if people have got concerns about the Bank of England, and I certainly think that they should have concerns, then we probably need to get involved with this public debate.
Yes, that particular public debate was taking place in Edinburgh. That event's passed, but there are other events around the country, so that link is still valid. Please do go and have a look at that, and maybe people would want to go and ask some questions about the Bank for International Settlements, for example.
And the relationship with the Bank of England.
Yeah.
And lastly, we just say, where does this go? Well, of course, this moves us on to the World Bank Group. And what is the World Bank Group interested in? Behavioural science around the world. On the right of your screen, you've got the countries that they've been looking into. And of course, they're now realising that the use of applied political psychology is something where they can manipulate populations in countries anywhere around the world. And certainly if you're BIS and operating as a private state, the public is not going to know what their real agenda is. We're going to have to end there, I think.
Yes.
But we've got some interesting little memes to show our audience.
Well, just a couple of final slides here. The first is from Bob Moran, of course, and he's got some graphs there with the Matterhorn and Kilimanjaro and Everest. And then the biggest mountain on the entire planet, of course, is the evidence of vaccine harms. Absolutely correct. And David, what's Russia investing into?
Yeah, so this is Russia invested billions into Nord Stream 1 and 2. And you see the clown starting to put on his makeup. It then sailed undetected all the way to Poland, and the clown's makeup's getting complete. Exactly where the US Navy was testing underwater drones days prior, and on goes the funny hairdo, and blew up their own pipeline, and we are now fully in clown world.
And then finally,
a small book. I would recommend this for every home. It's a book entitled The Government Means Well for You, Media Tells You the Truth, and Big Pharma Wants You Healthy, and other fairy tales for naive adults.
yeah, brilliant.
Excellent. Well, we've run on for quite a long UK column news today. I think it was worth it. We've covered some really important subjects. So thank you, David and Mark, for joining us. We'll have to end there. But before we go, I'd just like to say, during the news, we've had a guest in the UK column studio with us to have a look at how we do things. This is wonderful. We're able to do this sometimes for people who are showing an interest in what we're doing, but welcome. Okay, we'll end there. Thanks.
Back in a few seconds for some extra.
Okay, back in a few seconds for extra time. Thank you, everybody, for joining UK Column News today. Bye-bye.